He mocked an elderly man in first class. But when he realized who it was, his confidence crumbled. It was Clint Eastwood. The boarding area buzzed with early morning activity. The flight from Miami to Los Angeles was preparing for departure. Passengers clutched coffee cups and bags. They lined up in orderly rows, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. This was first class, and the atmosphere felt both luxurious and subdued. Among the passengers, one man stood out. Not just because of his impeccably tailored charcoal suit or gleaming leather loafers, but because of the way he carried himself with an air of superiority that demanded attention. He was in his late 30s. He looked like someone who had spent his life climbing the corporate ladder, collecting accolades, and never doubting his place at the top. He wasn't here just to fly. He was here to assert his dominance, even among strangers. As he walked toward the gate, his leather briefcase swung in perfect rhythm with his steps. He glanced at the other passengers with thinly veiled disdain. Soon he settled comfortably into his first-class seat. He scrolled through emails on his tablet as other passengers filed in. That's when he noticed the elderly man shuffling down the aisle, carrying nothing but a small duffel bag. The man was dressed modestly, not what you'd expect from a first-class passenger. His outfit consisted of a beige windbreaker, a plain flannel shirt, and scuffed sneakers. His face, though weathered by time, had a calmness to it, like someone who had seen enough of life to be unaffected by trivialities. The elderly man moved quietly. He settled into his seat without fuss. He adjusted his jacket, placed his bag under the seat in front of him, and leaned back, gazing out the window. To most, he might have seemed unremarkable, but to the businessman, he was an anomaly. The younger man glanced at him, then at the flight attendant helping passengers find their seats. With a smirk, he leaned over, just close enough for the elderly man to hear. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he said sarcastically. A few passengers turned their heads. But the elderly man didn't flinch. He merely glanced at the businessman, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips before turning back to the window. The lack of reaction irritated the businessman. Undeterred, he added, "What's the occasion? Did they hand out free upgrades today?" This time his tone was sharper, but the elderly man didn't take the bait. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and kept his gaze fixed on the tarmac. His silence was louder than any response. The flight attendants began their pre-flight checks. The businessman finally leaned back, satisfied with his attempt at humor. But as the plane began to taxi, something about the elderly man's calm demeanor started to gnaw at him. It wasn't just the silence. It was the quiet confidence, the unshakable sense of self, that felt almost out of place in a world where appearances seemed to mean everything. But the businessman wasn't ready to let it go. For him, the flight had just begun. And little did he know, so had a lesson he'd never forget. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a familiar rhythm. The occasional ding of a call button, the rustling of newspapers, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air. But the businessman, seated just a row away from the elderly man, couldn't let the interaction go. Something about the elderly man's presence, his calmness, his refusal to engage, felt like a challenge. He crossed one leg over the other and leaned slightly into the aisle. He glanced at the man, who continued to stare out the window. The businessman's lips curled into a smirk as he decided to press on. "I am curious," he said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "What brings someone like you to first class? Big lottery win? Or are you here to reminisce about the good old days when planes were powered by propellers?" A few passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort evident, but no one intervened. The elderly man didn't react immediately. He took a slow, measured breath before turning slightly toward the businessman. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The elderly man's gaze was steady, unbothered, as though he was sizing up the younger man's intentions. Then, without saying a word, he turned back to the window. The lack of response only emboldened the businessman. He leaned back in his seat, speaking louder now, his voice dripping with mockery. "Not much for conversation, huh? I guess you'd rather sit there thinking about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones." He chuckled to himself, but the elderly man remained silent. He folded his hands neatly in his lap and adjusted the cuff of his jacket. His silence spoke volumes. Nearby passengers began to shift in their seats. A woman in her 50s glanced at the businessman with disapproval. A young couple sitting across the aisle whispered to each other. The tension in the cabin grew thicker. but no one stepped in to stop the scene from escalating. The businessman, oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, turned to a man sitting across the aisle. "You know," he began, gesturing toward the elderly man, "people like to complain about progress, but I can't imagine wanting to go back to their time. No cell phones, no tech, no real innovation. How did they even survive back then?" The man across the aisle gave an uncomfortable laugh, clearly not wanting to get involved. But the businessman didn't notice her, didn't care. He continued, "They always talk about how things were better, but it's just nostalgia. The world's moved on. It's better now, no matter what they say." The flight attendant approached, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. Her professional smile was slightly strained. She reached the elderly man's row and leaned down. "Mr. Eastwood," she said with a warm, respectful tone, "would you like coffee or tea?" The moment the words left her mouth, the businessman froze. His tablet slipped from his hands onto his lap as the name hit him like a bolt of lightning. Eastwood. His mind raced, disbelief washing over him. Could it be? The elderly man turned toward the flight attendant and offered her a polite smile. "Coffee, black, please," he said in a calm, steady voice. The businessman's jaw tightened as he processed the name, the voice, and the face now taking shape in his memory. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, whose reputation preceded him in every room, every space. And here he was, sitting just a row away, quietly enduring the businessman's condescension. A ripple of whispers began to spread through the cabin as passengers caught on to the revelation. "Is that really him?" one woman murmured to her husband. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," another passenger whispered excitedly. The businessman's face turned pale as the truth settled in. The man he'd been mocking wasn't just any elderly passenger. He was a Hollywood icon, a figure synonymous with strength, resilience, and wisdom. The gravity of his mistake hit him all at once, leaving him speechless. But the realization wasn't the end of his humiliation. It was only the beginning of a lesson that would play out in front of the entire cabin. The businessman sat frozen in his seat, the weight of recognition pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Clint Eastwood. The name echoed in his mind as he struggled to connect the dots between the iconic figure he'd grown up hearing about and the quiet man in a beige windbreaker who had absorbed his jabs without a single word of protest. He stole another glance at Eastwood, who was now calmly sipping his coffee, seemingly unaware or simply unbothered by the ripple of whispers spreading through the cabin. Passengers leaned toward one another, their murmurs growing louder as the realization dawned on more and more of them. "That's Clint Eastwood, isn't it?" a woman a few rows back said excitedly to her husband. "Yeah, I am pretty sure it is," he replied, craning his neck for a better view. The businessman's ears burned as the words reached him. He slumped slightly in his seat, wishing he could somehow vanish into the cushions. The quiet conversations around him only magnified his embarrassment, each one like a tiny spotlight illuminating his foolishness. He clenched his hands around the armrests, his mind racing. How did I not recognize him? How could I have been so blind? But it wasn't just the fact that he hadn't recognized Eastwood. It was the way he'd spoken to him, dismissive, condescending, mocking. He'd treated him like an irrelevant relic of the past. And now the realization of just how wrong he'd been felt like a punch to the gut. Finally, he mustered the courage to speak. Leaning slightly forward in his seat, he said, "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood." His voice was quiet now, hesitant, a far cry from the loud, arrogant tone he'd used earlier. Eastwood turned his head slowly, his piercing eyes locking onto the businessman's. It wasn't an aggressive look, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of look that stopped people in their tracks, a gaze filled with quiet authority and the wisdom of someone who had seen and endured far more than most could imagine. "Yes," Eastwood said simply, his voice steady and calm. The businessman opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What was he supposed to say? "Sorry for being an ass? Sorry I didn't recognize you? Sorry for treating you like you didn't belong here?" None of it felt sufficient. I didn't realize," he stammered, his words trailing off awkwardly. Eastwood raised an eyebrow, waiting. His silence only made the businessman's discomfort grow. "I didn't mean to offend you," the businessman finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't realize who you were." For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed Eastwood's face. He set his coffee cup down on the tray table in front of him and leaned back slightly in his seat. "And if I wasn't who you think I am," he asked, his tone measured but sharp, Would that make the way you spoke to me okay? The businessman blinked, taken aback. What do you mean? Eastwood tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. If I were just some ordinary guy in a flannel shirt, would that justify the way you spoke to me? The businessman's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The question hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, all he could do was sit there, staring at the man he had so arrogantly dismissed. The murmurs in the cabin grew quieter as passengers tuned into the exchange. Even the flight attendants, who were busy moving through the aisles, slowed their pace, their eyes darting toward Eastwood and the businessman. The businessman swallowed hard, his face flushed with shame. I guess not, he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. Eastwood gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if that was the answer he'd expected all along. Then, without another word, he picked up his coffee and turned back toward the window, signaling that, for him, the conversation was over. But for the businessman, the moment was far from over. The lesson Eastwood had just delivered calmly, succinctly, and with more impact than any raised voice or angry retort ever could hung heavy in the air, and there was no escaping it. A few months later, the businessman found himself back at the airport, waiting for another flight. This time he wasn't dressed in a tailored suit, and he wasn't carrying a leather briefcase. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, and his only luggage was a small backpack. As he sat in the boarding area, he noticed a young family nearby. The parents looked exhausted, trying to calm their crying toddler. The businessman smiled and approached them. "Need a hand?" he asked. The mother looked up, surprised. "Oh no, we're fine," she said, though her tired eyes told a different story. "Let me help," the businessman said, reaching into his backpack. He pulled out a small toy car and handed it to the toddler. The child's tears stopped instantly, and he began playing with the toy. "Thank you," the father said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You are a lifesaver." The businessman shrugged. "It's nothing," he said. "We've all been there." As he boarded the plane, he thought about how much he had changed. The arrogant, self-assured man he used to be felt like a distant memory. In his place was someone who understood that true success wasn't about titles or wealth, it was about the impact you had on others. He found his seat and settled in, glancing out the window as the plane taxied down the runway. The flight attendant approached, offering him a drink. "Coffee black, please," he said, smiling as he remembered the lesson that had changed his life. As the plane climbed into the sky, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was someone who had learned that respect, kindness, and humility were the true measures of a person's worth. And as he sipped his coffee, he knew that Clint Eastwood's words would stay with him forever.